Today's lecture is titled Wildlife After the Woolsey Fire, Research Images on Display. And it's my pleasure to welcome Miroslava Munguia Ramos. Miroslava is the Woolsey Fire Recovery Project Lead with the Santa Monica Mountains Fund, the official nonprofit partner of the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area. She has worked under the Interpretation, Education, and Volunteer Division of the National Park Service to provide public programming, school field trips, and engaging volunteer experiences for park visitors. She began her Santa Monica Mountain Fund career as a program supervisor for college-age interns looking to explore careers in public land management. Now collaborating with the Wildlife Division, she works regularly with volunteers and citizen community scientists to showcase some of the park's research and help make it more accessible to the public. Miroslava received her undergraduate degree from UC Davis with a major in environmental science and management and a minor in wildlife, fish, and conservation biology. She has recruited and led citizen community scientists for years across California to study the state's biodiversity using molecular-based research, including environmental DNA and crowdsourced platforms like iNaturalist. We're so glad to have you here today. I'm so sorry the area is experiencing yet another fire. I don't know, you might touch upon that, but we're excited to hear about your current research, and we hope you have a terrific lecture today. Thank you for being with us.
Yes, thank you on behalf of the whole 50 and Better series with Cal Lutheran. It's a real honor and a pleasure to chat with you all. Good morning. I hope everyone's doing well, staying safe, especially with the recent fires that began this week. And it's always a rule of thumb I tell folks, be safe, be smart. If there's evacuation notices, now's not the time to go recreating in that area. But it is my incredible pleasure to be jumping on this call and chatting a bit more about the research that the Wildlife Division does here in the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area. So there's this lecture, I have it split up into two parts, which I'll talk about in a bit. The first part is going to be focused primarily on the details of the research itself, while the second half of the project or the program will be dedicated to showcasing the highlight images on display. So hopefully you can stick around with us the entire time. I do aim to have a break after answering questions and questions. So I do encourage everyone to type in the chat if you have questions that come to mind or comments. I really enjoy interactive conversations, so I'm not just, chatting to a screen. So I encourage everyone to jump in for those who are interested in, chatting a bit more. So again, thank you for the introduction. Thank you for joining me today, and let's get started. So like I mentioned, we're going to have two parts for this program. The first is going to talk about the research itself, so talking about the significance of the Santa Monica Mountains, the history of wildfires in our area, the research project's goals, preliminary data, and what we hope to accomplish in the near future. Part two will be dedicated to showcasing a wide variety of images that specifically come from the research portion of this project. So lots to look forward to. And I always like starting my presentations acknowledging that I am just one person talking, but it takes a huge team to get any of this work put together, presented, and understandable. So it's not just jargon, even to me. So I always like highlighting not only the biologists that work with the National Park Service, the graduate student who started this when she was at UCLA, but of course, it takes a series of agencies, organizations, private landowners who give us access and permission to place cameras all across the park, as well as continue research. So huge shout out. And of course, like was mentioned in the introduction, it takes a team of volunteers to go out regularly. So huge, huge, huge thank you. I am just one person talking, but it takes truly a team to get any of this accomplished. So we know that here in Southern California, we are special for a wide variety of reasons. When we zoom out on a global scale, we can look and admire that we're one of the very few 30+ global biodiversity hotspots in the world. So the map you see here is the land mass all across the world, and everything highlighted in that red is looking at global biodiversity hotspots. So what this means is that it's a very small, relatively small land area with a high concentration of species, whether it be insects, bugs, fungi, birds, mammals, plants. If there's a lot of diversity in a very compact area, it's considered a hotspot. But what makes it very bittersweet in these areas is that to be considered a global biodiversity hotspot, there needs to be a certain number of species of plants, and there can only about 70% of the natural resources in that area have been degraded for any way, shape, or form. So in all these areas, so we're looking at Mesoamerica, we're looking at the Caribbean, we're looking at Madagascar, we're looking at the Mediterranean basin. Only 30% of the natural remaining resources are available for, again, this really concentrated number of species or populations in an area. So we're always have them on our radar, because if something happens, we can lose species that aren't found anywhere else in the world. We can lose ecosystems that are truly unique and support a wide variety of species. So we consider them hotspots. They're always on our radar. And lucky us, we're one of the 30 plus in our California floristic province. We have several dozens of rare endangered species just here in Southern California, and blow it up to the state, we have species that are found nowhere else. So really unique in one sense. And if we go even further and we're looking at the biomes or the type of ecosystems that are supported across the world, we're one of only 5 areas that have this unique Mediterranean ecosystem. So long, dry summers, short, wet winters. So again, you're only going to find this type of habitat, and it makes sense because we have tourists left and right all year round, that we have a high demand. There's always interest in this, 300 plus days out of the year, we have sunshine coming around and really enjoyable habitat, which makes it really sustainable for a lot of species. So again, across the whole world, we're one of 30 plus regions with this biodiversity hotspot. And then if you look even further, we're one of only 5 places in the world that have this unique Mediterranean biome. So there's us, there's central Chile, there's the Mediterranean basin, where the name comes from, there's the southern tip of Africa, and the southwest corner of Australia. And if you zoom down to where we are here in the Santa Monica Mountains, we are a national recreation area, so we're part of the National Park Service. And you'll see on this map, we stretch between Los Angeles and Ventura counties. We cover over 25 different zip codes, and we're the largest urban national park in the United States. And for this map, I don't want you to focus too much on specific sites or trails, because it's very difficult to see on a screen. But I do want to highlight the different shades of green you're going to see on here. Those that are in a slightly darker tint of green are managed by the federal government or the National Park Service itself. And those that are managed on a lighter green are managed by state parks or state park agencies, such as MRCA, the Mountains Recreation and Conservation Authority, California State Parks, or the Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy. So altogether, we're in this rare place across the world with this very unique ecosystem. We're one of the biggest urban national parks in the world, and we're a multi-agency land managing group. So there's a lot going on in this really compact area across 2 counties, across multiple dozens of zip codes, and we cover thousands of acres of land. So there's a lot going on. And of course, you can see that as you're going hiking out and about in the park. So I'd love to see, for those who are interested, if you want to write in the chat some of your favorite places to go hiking or cruising around in the Santa Monica Mountains. We say we have coasts, valleys, and mountains. So you can be right along the Pacific Coast Highway early morning, enjoy that nice cool breeze as it fogs up. You have that marine layer keeping you nice and chilly. You work your way into the canyon, and you have this distinct ecosystem where the vegetation, flourishes, you get some more sunshine. And then the higher up in elevation you go, you get a lot more exposure to sun. You're much more prone to getting chilly when it comes to the wind. So there's a wide variety, even just looking at elevation gradients in the mountains. And of course, within the wide variety of terrain you have, you're also going to see a lot of different wildlife. You'll see the I think it's either federally or state, I have to double check, listed Humboldt lily on the top left corner. You'll have mule deer on the bottom left corner. You have our iconic rattlesnakes on the top right. You'll have scorpions that bioluminesce under UV light on the bottom right corner. You've got butterflies constantly working around pollinating our wide variety of flowers. And of course, we have insectivorous or insect-eating birds on the bottom middle image. So regardless of where you go and what your interests are and what you're keeping your eye out for, there's a lot going on biodiversity-wise in the Santa Monica Mountains. From the tiniest of insects to the largest of oak trees, it supports a very wide range of life and recreation as a whole. Some folks are more into mountain biking, some folks are more into cruising, some folks are more into hiking. as long as you're doing it safe and responsibly, by all means, go for it and enjoy admiring the wildlife we have here in the park. Now, it's important to note that the park is protected. We want nature to do its thing, live its course, do what it does, with as minimal human intervention as possible. And one of the realities that we were reminded of just a few days ago is that a natural part of our ecosystem involves wildfires. Now, it's one of these things that I like to preface that for these talks, I'm focusing primarily on the ecological side of wildfires. I don't want to get too much into the socioeconomic because that's well outside of my range of knowledge. But when we're looking at wildfires, they're a natural occurring system factor when it comes to these Mediterranean climates. And I always like prefacing folks that wildfires on their own are not a bad thing. They're a part of the ecosystem. What's gotten really scary recently is the frequency in which they're occurring. We're getting to points where, especially in the chaparral or that shrubland plant community that we have primarily across the Santa Monica Mountains, they are adapted to fires. They are not dependent on fires. So again, in our climate, in our ecosystem, wildfires are expected, but with decades of a gap between large major fires. So our plants will do okay as long as there's enough time to breathe in between each fire session. In comparison with ecosystems like those in Sequoia, where these large trees are reliant on fires to germinate their seeds, we're not on that scale. We'll do okay with the fire, but we are not looking forward to a fire regularly. And if we're looking across history at the range of fires we've had since we've become a national recreation area, our current fire interval, or on average, we're looking at seeing a large scale fire about once every 28 years or so. And this is drastically shorter than what we estimate to be the natural fire interval between 70 and 100 years. Of course, this number is going to vary a lot depending on which parts of the park you're looking at. If you're looking at specific canyons, whether it be Solstice, whether it be Latigo versus across the whole park boundary, or if at the range of times for the time frame that we're looking at with this range. But even then, if you're looking on average, 28 years is significantly shorter than the 70 to 100 we would expect an ecosystem like this to undergo these large scale fires. And again, I do want to mention that some areas in the park have burned 13 times since the National Recreation Area was established in 1978. Other areas haven't burned since. So there's a huge range, a huge variety. So the average, take it with a grain of salt. It's a number to keep in mind, but it's not the catch-all of everything that's going on in the park. And of course, with these plants, they're not used to having so many fires in an area. So they're very sensitive. They need that period of time to catch their breath, recover, and kind of go on with the show. A majority of the native plants we have here, and I'm referring to plants because if you have a solid vegetation, a solid ecosystem with plants and fungi and a healthy soil system, the animals will come and settle in. So we're kind of working from the ground up here. And if we're looking at these shrubland ecosystems, if there's too much fire at the time, they're not going to have enough time to catch their breath. Most of this native vegetation in California, they're very deeply rooted. So for reference, let's say the roots are my hand here and my elbow, if the green screen isn't messing with it too much, is the nice green, leafy, showy part of the plant we would see. If the fire were to damage any part of the top plant, these roots are staying nice and healthy because they're deeply rooted and they're not going to be too impacted by the fire. But we're getting to the point where these areas are constantly getting burned. So these roots are getting exposed and there's getting long-term damage to these deeply rooted plants. And of course, if we see enough of this degradation of the shrublands, we're actually going to see a change in vegetation communities. So where we would expect to see lush, gorgeous, shrubby areas, over time can turn into grasslands. So we're losing an entire ecosystem within the Santa Monica Mountains. And remember, we're in that global biodiversity hotspot. We're in one of only 5 areas with this Mediterranean biome. So even losing a small percentage of a habitat can have disastrous impacts when it comes to populations of species that are highly reliant and highly specialized in places that aren't found anywhere else in the world. So we need to be really careful when it comes to losing even what seems like a small property across a greater scheme of the mountain range because you're not sure what species, what animals, what organisms are relying on that teeny tiny patch of land, especially with these grand scale changes over time. And of course, as we are noticing in the world, there are changes in the climate when it comes to seeing, for example, the past 10, 15 years, we've had California had one of the worst droughts it had in recorded history. So as these temperature rises and the length of a drought or years without much rain increases, we're seeing that this vegetation, it's getting crunchier, it's getting drier, and fuel moisture becomes very critical in that if it's really dry and very windy, just like what happened this week with the Franklin Cat fire, a small spark can take off and have extend periods of time of fire season. So with our team, it's not so much that we're worried about the fire season. We look at the peak fire season, but we're constantly on the lookout year round just because of the changes our climate has had that we're understanding until now in the recent history. So again, wildfires are a natural part of this kind of ecosystem. Fires themselves are not the scary thing. It's the frequency that we're concerned about and the short recovery time that these plants are going to have to seemingly fight through. And on this map here, this is showing ignition points of wildfires recorded since 1978, again, when the National Recreation Area was first established, through 2017, so right before the Woolsey fire began. And I don't want you to focus too much on where each ignition point started, but I want you to look at the general trends. So the yellow stars represent from 1978 to 1989. The light orange represent the 90s altogether. The orangish points are from the early thousands, and the reddish or the dark maroon is looking at 2010 onward. Now, ignitions do not mean there was a wide-scale fire. Fortunately, a lot of times these ignitions are maintained within a few acres because we have an incredible support team here when it comes to collaborating with fire protection. But I want you to notice and see that there's going to be a lot more darker points on the map, and a lot of them are being concentrated where there's major roads. So we can see just from our history that humans, intentional or not, are having impacts as to how common or how often these ignition points begin in such an urbanized park. We'd be silly to ignore that we don't have a factor when it comes to preserving these lands. And again, as the largest urban national park, we need to be very mindful of roads, crossings, and again, our impact on the ecosystem as a whole. So again, we're noticing with recent droughts, with a lot of dried vegetation, with little rain, with how much urbanization we have in a large scale park like this, it kind of just became the perfect storm in November of 2018. So on November 8th at around 2:30 in the Santa Susana Field Laboratory, again, all it took was a small spark. And after reports and studies came to be, it was concluded that the fire began from a Southern California Edison power line near the Chatsworth substation. It just took a little spark, windy conditions, especially with the Santa Andas, and that major drop made it the perfect storm so that one little spark basically took off and the wildfire kind of just ran with it, no hesitation altogether. So within a day, 24 hours, the fire began in the Santa Susanas, so around Simi Hills. I think of it more as like the northern tip of the San Fernando Valley. It worked its way down and around. So again, we're thinking like the Upper Lost Version is Preserve. We're thinking around Chesborough Canyon, and it crossed the freeway within 20 hours, and it burned almost 73,000 acres. In comparison, this week with the Franklin fire, we're on alert. We're moving everything around. We're at about 4,000 or between 3,000 and 4,000 acres, if I'm not mistaken, within 2 or 3 days of ignition. So imagine that just, quadrupled, quintupled, exponentially growing in that same period of time. By far, the Woolsey fire is the largest wildfire in our park's history. And because it covered such a wide range and because we're such an urbanized park, over 290,000 people were evacuated. Over 1,600 structures were destroyed, whether they be homes, buildings, recreation areas altogether. Unfortunately, a smaller number were damaged, but still salvageable. And with our firefighting team, with us, the county, Ventura County, or us, Los Angeles and Ventura County, the priority was always saving lives, then property, then resources. Lives cannot be salvaged, property can be rebuilt, and resources over time will come to be, but our firefighter team made it very clear the priority was making sure people were kept as safe as possible. And after about 2-ish weeks of containment and fire management, the fire was 100% contained on November 22nd, 2018. So we bring up the Woolsey fire a lot, not because we know a lot about it, which we're still learning the impacts of it, which we'll talk about later today, but because it was such a big fire, there's so much to assess and study. So seemingly small questions like, what's going to happen next? Turns into 12 different tangents that go into 4 different other tangents and loopholes and all these things to really dig into. So here, there we go. So here we have a map of the largest fires we've had before the Woolsey fire. So from left to right, we can see there's the Springs Fire of 2013. This impacted primarily the western tip of the Santa Monica Mountains. So you're looking at Rancho Sierra Vista, at Point Mugu State Park, right along basically up to the naval base we have there. And it burned just over 23.5 acres in 2013. Just underneath that was the Green Meadows Fire in 1993. So it's that bottom left corner. And it burned 38,500 acres. So like I mentioned earlier, some areas burn much more frequently than others, and a lot of times it has to do with how much concentration there is of human activity, whether it be roads, whether it be parking lots, whether it be cars, or even freeways. There's just a lot, it's right along the Conejo Grade, so it makes sense there. And then in 2005, there's the Topanga Fire that burned Topanga Canyon, so right in the middle of the San Fernando Valley, and it burned about 23,000 acres. So I want you to focus less on the numbers and more on the scale, the range, and where the fire was hit. So the Springs and Green Meadows Fire were the western corner of the park. The Topanga Fire was like kind of in the center on the right around the freeway boundary line. So keep in mind, take a quick mental picture, stare at the screen a little too long so it stays nice and fresh in your head. So when I show you this next map, you can see the range and the scale that the Woolsey Fire had in the Santa Monica Mountains. So all in all, the Woolsey Fire burned 96,900 acres, which is more than the previous 3 largest fires combined. Over half of the Simi Hills natural area was burned, and just under half of the entire Santa Monica Mountains range, regardless of which agency is under that land management, was burned. So even as you're hiking out and about on various trails, you're still going to see remnants of the fire, not because, the trees are taking their time or not because we're not off making sure the trails are safe. It's just with these huge fires, it's going to take a lot of time for the ecosystem to recover. And it's really exciting, especially when you're looking around with oaks are a really good example. The cute little trees with the lobed leaves on the side of them, where the bark might be charred still and kind of charcoaly, but you'll still see luscious green leaves growing out from the tips of it. So again, huge impact all around in the national recreation area. And just a clear map to see where the fire hit. Again, that purple boundary layer or that boundary perimeter shows you the national recreation area. The dark green is showing you land managed by the federal government or the National Park Service, and that light green is land managed by state parks or state agencies. And then, of course, that reddish blob that kind of swoops its way through most of the park is the fire perimeter of the Woolsey Fire. So again, well over half of the park, the national recreation area, and nearby mountain ranges were impacted. And then if you're looking into like the nitty gritty, if you were to look at property managed just by the National Park Service, 88% of it was burned. So again, big impact. We're still understanding the impacts of it, not only from a plant's perspective, but also a wildlife perspective, from a cultural resources perspective, from a soils perspective. You ask one question and there's tons of tangents to go down with it. And of course, with such a big fire, that's when researchers were thinking, okay, big question, how are we going to try containing something like this and understanding it? How do we, go best from here? And this is when, altogether, we're trying to understand what was impacted. So this image on your left here was through one of the wildlife cameras we have from a separate project, but it caught the moment the fire crossed over on the 101 freeway. And we're looking at damages that were sustained specifically with the Park Service. Most of Western Town, or for those who are familiar with Paramount Ranch, there are these big historic film structures were entirely decimated. Fortunately, thanks to partners like the Santa Monica Mountains Fund and philanthropic efforts, we're working on rebuilding it, and we hope to have it complete sometime next year. The Peter Strauss Ranch, which was established in I think it was 1927, if I'm not mistaken, entirely gone. So there's still hiking trails accessible, and the park hosts festivals there every now and then and free concerts. But instead of seeing a nice house and a ranch, it's now just the foundation outline. The Rocky Oaks Ranger residence was entirely decimated as well. And what really stung, especially for our cultural resources team, is that they had just completed a museum to collect archives of historic remnants across the park. It had just opened in 2018, and we lost pretty much, I think, like 95% of all the artifacts from that fire. The Arroyo Saquite Ranger residence entirely decimated, a significant portion of the UCLA La Crête study research station, and of course, there was significant damage across the recreation trails and bridges. So, of course, it took a team, and it still takes a team to assess and see what can be open and salvaged across these areas. But if we're just looking at things that we as people built and set up for recreation, for safety, a lot of it was impacted from this fire. We have some before and after images from our vegetation monitoring team, which I'll touch base a little bit more on in this presentation. But they'll go out and they'll go to the same consistent sites regularly to see, okay, what plants, what trees, what grasses are in the area. The image on the left was taken about 2 months before the fire hit. So right before things start turning brown and crunchy for the fall season. And the image on the right was taken about a month after the fire hit. So it's night and day. You have this, thick, dense chaparral with a shrubby vegetation to just barren, almost like a moonscape. And a lot of rangers who were here before, during, and after the fire, who can see those changes, they said it felt very surreal. Because where you would expect to hear birds and chirping and sounds and movement, it was almost echoing off each other because there was no vegetation to help kind of bounce the noise. It just was, well, barren. And at this point, too, with no vegetation or deeply rooted plants, a lot of the park was subject to soil erosion and landslides because there was nothing holding all that dirt down. So without those roots, dirt would just slide on down, especially with the large rainy seasons we had shortly after the fire. When we're looking at specifically the wildlife that was impacted, it's hard to tell the number of species that were impacted or the exact number of populations that were where numbers were changed altogether. But we can look at the collared animals. So our biologists go out with proper permits, of course, and training, and they'll collar select species to see their home ranges, how they change, how they prefer certain habitats, how they adapt to their environment altogether. Of the 11 mountain lions that were near the area of the fire, so this is excluding the late P22 who lived in Griffith Park and another lion who was outside of the area, 2 succumbed to the fire. So P64, who was commonly known as the culvert cat, survived the fire, but we believed he starved to death with burnt paws, and I'll talk about him later on. P79, or the 79th mountain lion, or puma, in our study, was believed to be killed by the fire. So these collars will send out GPS points a few times a day, and it'll let you know after, a lack of movement after X number of hours that it'll send a mortality signal. So when the researchers went out to try finding the body in the collar, neither of them were found. So they believe that the fire kind of just disintegrated the body altogether. So by the time it was safe enough to go assess and see where the lion was, it was entirely gone. So again, P79 is believed to be killed by the fire. We're like pretty confident, but because we couldn't find the collar nor the lion, it's hard to say for sure. Of the 4 collared bobcats we had in the area, they fortunately all were able to survive the fire. And B362 ended up having her kittens in someone's backyard. And I'll talk about her case in just a few moments. And talking about ecosystem impacts, I'd be silly not to highlight our incredible restoration team. So again, another huge collaboration with the Park Service, as well as SAMO Fund technicians, staff, and of course, volunteers altogether. Since the Woolsey fire, have planted over 150,000 plants back into the national park and the footprint of where the fires hit. And for these projects, they focus primarily on planting where the Springs and the Woolsey fire hit. And all of these plants, the seeds are collected from the park, grown in the native plant nurseries supported by the Santa Monica Mountains Fund. And then once the plants are at a teenage stage where they're off to go off and, they're ready to go to college and establish themselves, with a team of volunteers and our technicians, we place them back into pre-established sites to help recover and, again, give our environment a nice leg up. When we're looking across all of our sites for these vegetation survivorship rates, shrubs and herbs are surviving about 60% of the time, meaning for every 10 plants we plant, 6 of them survive. Our tree survivorship is going to vary a little bit more, just depending on the site, between 55 and 85%. So for every 10 trees we've been planting, between 5 and 9 of them are making it and surviving it past, I think if they check after 2 or 3 years. So we're doing great, and we're seeing that, with human intervention, we're able to restore a bit of that ecosystem. So it's a fine balance. We want to monitor, we want to study, and by establishing these plants first, we'll help the other native vegetation, the native wildlife, kind of get back on their feet and get to it. Looking specifically at the wildlife, P64 was a adult male mountain lion known as the culvert cat. And he just knew what to do when it came with the established wildlife crossings across the 101 and 118 freeways. So he knew how to go underneath in these culverts, underneath to get across property relatively well. And it was really exciting to see that he was able to cross it right away. So when the fire hit, of course, we were thinking, okay, he's comfortable going back and forth between freeways and knows how to do it and survive each time. 42 times is a big accomplishment. Of course, researchers were thinking right away, what's going to happen at this point? So if we follow along my little cursor here on the map, all these green points you see here are GPS locations that we got of P64 before the fire began. So before November 8th, 2018, we can see this mountain lion was moving. He was going back and forth, walking around, easy peasy. And then November 8th at 2:30, on the top right of this map, you'll see the ignition point over in the Santa Susana Mountains. And this red line shows you the boundary of the fire. So you can see this mountain lion was going pretty much living and existing right where the fire hit. So all these green points represent where this mountain lion was moving. And then you'll see at these red points is where P64 was when the fire began. So if you follow along on this black arrow, we can see that P64 was zooming, going around, doing his lion things. And then as the fire hit, you can tell we're assuming, he was trying to get away from the fire, and he's working his way towards homes, towards cities, towards paved road where there's less vegetation, there's less fire kindling for the fire to go. Right at midnight of November 8th, again, right around the time the fire crossed the 101 freeway, kind of just stops. He's hanging out, he's kind of circling around, and you'll see the timestamps here between 10 p.m., midnight, 2 a.m., 4 a.m. He's just not moving. He's moving, but not a significant distance. And then we see his points as the days go by. He works his way back towards the fire, and then these yellow points represent where his mortality signal came in. And researchers believe, again, there's a lot of it is speculation, just because we weren't there, we weren't able to see and or ask the animal what was going on. We believe that there might have been a lot of firefighter police evacuation activity. So even if this mountain lion, this cat, was trying to get out, trying to avoid the vegetation and going towards these paved roads where there is minimal kindling for the fire to catch, mountain lions are still cats. They might have gotten freaked out with the lights, the activity, the siren, the noise, and ended up staying in that fire perimeter, even though there was no other place for this cat to go. So he ended up working his way back and around. And again, after time had passed and it was safe enough for our researchers to go and see the cause of death for the mountain lion, they had seen that P64's paws were burnt and his body was very emaciated. So it's believed that P64 ended up starving to death because he wasn't able to hunt because of his burnt paws from the fire. Now, again, this is just one case study. And because of the technology we're using, we can track generally where these animals are going. And with the additional information from our vegetation teams, from our fire team, we're able to piece together the story to the best of our ability. So while some animals burned entirely in the fire, like we believe P72 did, animals like P64 might not have been directly impacted by the fire, but by the indirect impacts ended up leading to his unfortunate demise. When we're looking at our 4 bobcats that were collared in the area, there is B362. So she was actually collared the night before the fire began. And you can see on this map, there's one little yellow point on this corner of the red line representing the fire perimeter. That was her initial starting point. So we can see that B362 was hanging out in these altered open spaces. So they're not urbanized, they're not concrete, but they're not entirely all natural. So perfect example would be like a golf course. We do our part to make sure you have nice, luscious green yard, but it's not entirely natural necessarily because we are having that influence and that impact. So B362 fortunately survived the fire. And we noted after, before and after the fire, she was hanging out, she's like a cat, still avoiding people. She's kind of bouncing around this fire perimeter and she's jumping right away into this gated community. So again, think like those golf courses. So it's natural to an extent, but still heavily influenced by people. And researchers noted that there is a concentration of points, if you see this little cluster in purple here, that she just was not moving from one area. And fortunately, the caller showed that she was alive. We hadn't received a mortality notification. And researchers got curious and went around, and turns out she had actually had her den of kittens in someone's backyard. This was the first ever recorded kitten den in a residential yard since this bobcat study began over 30 years ago. So it was really exciting to see that, despite the fire impacting and leading to loss of life of a lot of animals, we're still seeing some critters, in this case B362, adapting and adjusting to this new normal post-fire. And our biologists constantly joke that this is probably the first and only time our research was featured in People magazine. So I'm just imagining you have like Patrick Dempsey on the cover and then inside, wow, kittens in someone's home. So really exciting, uplifting story that changes are here, but animals and wildlife are able to adapt when the available resources are there. And of course, with all of this, there's a lot of uncertainty. The question is, what's next? What's going to happen? These are 2 animals across a huge space, and it's not representative of the whole ecosystem. So that's where researchers came together across the agencies and decided, you know what, this is the time, let's start monitoring to see how things are coming back after the fire. So the initial study design was developed the summer after the fire, so summer of 2019, by biologists with their Park Service, as well as UCLA grad students who were excited to figure out what was happening after the fire. So the primary goals and objectives of the project, of course, were to monitor the recovery of natural systems, including wildlife communities, after the fire. We want to understand the impacts of future fires by providing a new baseline of pre-fire data. It's hard to compare how things are looking if you don't have a before. So now 6 years after the project was 6 years, many years after the fire or after the projects have been established, we're focusing less on how things are recovering, and it's now turning into this long-term monitoring. So if and when, because again, we're in this Mediterranean ecosystem, in this hotspot of biodiversity, we know wildfires are a natural part of it. So we want to be able to monitor what happens before, during, and after so we can properly assess and adjust if restoration efforts are needed, how we can best address them in that given period of time. So we're now providing pre-fire data. And again, perfect context or a perfect example would be with the Franklin fire that began a few days ago. I have 2 cameras that are right on that fire perimeter, and I'm humbly very indifferent to if we lose the cameras, that's fine, as long as folks are evacuated, but we have clear data of what things look like before. So when things are safe to go and assess and see the damage, we have that clear after. So this project is helping us provide that baseline of information. Of course, this is also going to give us information about wildlife communities all across the park, and it's going to help us monitor for large-scale changes, including this little thing known as the Wallace-Annenberg Wildlife Crossing. So we're going to be using data from this project to see how populations, how communities, how the number of detections are changing on either side of the freeway, especially between the Santa Monica Mountains and Simi Hills. So it's exciting to see that this one project that was focused primarily on the Woolsey fire is being expanded. It's working in this interdivisional, very cross-agency based way. So for this project specifically, you'll see the image on the left has all these different colors and little points showing the location of 180 randomly selected sites in grassland, shrubland, and riparian or river-based ecosystems. We have 60 wildlife cameras, which I'll talk about in a little bit, that are rotated pretty regularly across these sites. So the number of sites are pretty evenly spaced out in an area. So you're not going to have too many higher concentration of areas in Simi Hills versus in Temescal Canyon versus in Solstice Canyon. It's spaced out so that it's random, so we're not prioritizing one location over the other, and consistent, so we're regularly monitoring all the park in an even way. When the sites were selected, we made sure to prioritize, of course, areas that were impacted by the Woolsey fire, one, because that was the primary goal of the project, and two, because so much of the park was burned by the Woolsey fire. So about 75% of the sites are in areas that were burned, and 25% are in areas that weren't burned, or known as the control of the project. And these cameras are rotated several times a year by volunteers and technicians. So like I said, I'm just talking to you. Have a team of people who have been gracious enough to give me their time, support, and effort to go out and fight ticks and hang out with rattlesnakes to place these cameras off the sites. So covers a huge range, and we're constantly moving these cameras out and about to make sure we're looking at seasonality changes. We're looking at how things are changing over the year. So when we're looking at a wildlife camera trap, it's called a trap because it's triggered by an animal walking through. So in this image, you'll see the top has an infrared array, so it'll take clear nighttime photos without the need of flash. We're not going to spook the animals there. We have a light meter, so it'll determine whether or not that infrared or flash is needed. We have the camera lens, and we have the passive infrared motion detector. So it's basically a beam that if anything crosses it, it'll take a series of photos. And on this image, because our screens are various, it looks really big. This is a camera. It's about the size of my hand. It's nothing too big. It's pretty sturdy. We've had cameras submerged, buried under sediment, and they're still taking photos to an extent, depending on how dirty the lens are. But it's a pretty sturdy camera, intentionally made to be weatherproof, animal-proof, somewhat people-proof. But we have 60 of these, and again, they're rotated all across the park. I always like stressing that while it's a great idea and it's awesome to see what animals are out and about, all of our cameras and our projects are granted with permission and permits. We do not allow recreationalists to go out and place cameras on national park property unless they're with a research affiliate organization or school or university. What you choose to place on your own private property is very much up to you, but because it's happened before, please don't go out and place wildlife camera traps on National Park Service property. The cameras are intentionally placed off trail in covert areas, so we don't want people messing with them. We also don't want a bunch of hikers. We want to primarily focus on the animals and the wildlife that are there. And we make sure we turn off the flash, we don't use sound, and we minimize the reflection of the camera and the post that's installed on, because we don't want to disturb or influence animal behavior, but instead we just want to catch them as they're going on nice and by. So this image on the left here, if you squint between all this sage, you can just barely make out the posts and where the camera is installed right in the middle of it. We clear the nearby vegetation so we get a nice clear view of the animal. Otherwise, we'll get the same piece of grass dancing in front of the camera for hours on end. And we make sure to, again, we're very strategic. We don't just hack away at plants. We want to make sure we clear what we can without disturbing the environment. It'd be very bittersweet and very counterintuitive if we're just going away and severely impacting the environment to see, oh, what's over here now? We want to see what's there with minimal intervention. These posts are left for months at a time. So we have someone go out, place the camera, install it there, come back 3 months later, and then we're able to see what's been going out and about in the area. And of course, with so many cameras placed for so long, we rely heavily on a volunteer who uses artificial intelligence or AI to help us sort through images, whether it's a blank animal, person, or vehicle, or the image on your left is a tip of, I think, of a rabbit's ear. And for reference, in the past year and a half worth of data, we've collected over just about 1.5 million photos. 80+% of them are blank, meaning they're triggered by wind or vegetation or just nothing's there. About 60% of them have an actual animal in them, which is great. That's what we want. People in it, which again means some folks are out and about intentionally going off trails and just happen to bump into our cameras. And a very small percentage of them are vehicles, because we do have cameras that are placed somewhat by parking lots. And again, you have mountain bikers. And for this system, anything with wheels is considered a vehicle. And we have volunteers who help us actually go through and identify the animals, which I'll talk about near the end of this first portion of the talk. So a lot of images, a lot of cameras, a lot of environmental factors. So we want to be very strategic with how we place the cameras. Otherwise, you'll end up with, wow, this looks really pretty, right? You have all this vegetation, but imagine having thousands of photos of this same vegetation just dancing in the wind casually. If you're going for, a nice calming environment, that's awesome. But for this project, we're focusing on the wildlife. So thousands of images of dancing grass will eat up our battery, take up all our SD card, and we might miss that coyote that's going through or that covey of quail zooming on by. So again, it's really strategic, and it's not just placing the camera wherever it fits best. We want to make sure we maximize our efforts and make the most out of it. And then when we're lucky, we get that beautiful shot where you can clearly see the animal, you can see what it's doing, and it kind of just takes your breath away, right? Because where else are you going to see this young buck, this juvenile male mule deer in a field of wildflowers, just casually looking at the camera like, oh, what's going on? This is pretty neat. So this is a teaser for part 2 of our presentation and our time here. And of course, these photos are not just, because they look cool. They provide us valuable data of what's going on in that area. So on the top left, you can see on that black bar that's on each of the images, we have the date and the time the photo was taken. So in this case, you can see it's pretty early-ish in the morning. On the bottom left, we place a camera identification number. So we're able to go back on our notes and see, okay, camera number 30 was, took a photo of this deer sometime in 2022. Let's go back to our notes so we can confirm the location. And on the top right there, you're going to see the temperature, the temperature when the photo was taken, as well as the moon phase. I always joke with folks, we don't think and or don't know if animals are into astrology necessarily, but there have been studies showing that, especially with small mammals who are rodents, that their behavior will change whether or not there's a full moon. So the more information we can provide, again, this is all research, the better we can have context. And again, you'll get some really great photos, including a gray fox hanging out on a fallen sycamore. You can tell this photo was taken nice and early in the morning at 4:42 a.m. in 2021. It was pretty chilly. The top right tells you it was 55 degrees, and this was taken with camera number 18. So again, these images look awesome, but we have to remind ourselves, this is data we're collecting. Makes a great screensaver, and I have to catch myself too every now and then, but no, this is research primarily. And of course, it would be silly for me not to mention some of the exciting adventures you get into when you're placing the cameras. So in a perfect world, perfect environment, you're able to have the location, have your camera, and just go hiking straight to the site. When you're working outside and you are working with the natural elements, nothing is ever as clear-cut as that, because nature will do what nature will do, and it's pretty much anything and everything. And fortunately, this is one of the best annoyances I can have in the field here. You'll see the site here on the left image. You have the post here, the corner of my foot, and one of the park staff who joined me in the field this day, and it's just covered in dense vegetation, which is really annoying to hike through. But again, that means the environment's recovering, where it's no longer that barren landscape we saw earlier. There's growth coming back. There's movement once again. And you wouldn't think it's a big deal. And then you're hiking through all of it. And then here I am fighting through a lot of dense vegetation. And I didn't think anything of it. I thought, it's casual Monday for me, right? Just going to deploy a camera. And the ranger on the left had this really great sense of humor, and he didn't decide to tell me until about 10 minutes in, you're staying in a bunch of dried poison oak, right? So it's fun. We do have a lot of vegetation growth, whether it's plants you want to mess with or not. But we are seeing these ecosystems recover, even just placing the cameras without looking at the data necessarily. You'll get to your site and you're excited to just place the camera, but then you remember that there were a series of atmospheric rivers and storms and a bunch of things and debris washed through. So whereas your post is expected to be upright and vertical and in a convenient position to place a camera, you will find tires and other very large debris. And if you're really lucky, a fallen tree right on top of your post, meaning you'll have to come back with other equipment to reinstall it altogether. Still very funny because you go with a good attitude and a sense of humor about it. And you're like, yes, nature will be nature. Other times, you're really, really lucky. You'll get to the site, you realize your post is not there, hike around and find it washed down a few hundred meters away. And then you're able to place it that same day and reinstall and place the camera. So again, nature is healing and nature will be nature. And then what we have to do is when we place the camera, we need to make sure it's at an appropriate height. And for us, we do the very scientific, only a select few can do it. You need to get certifications on it. Crawl test, where we get down on all fours and crawl towards the camera just to make sure it's at an appropriate height. We as humans tend to be taller than a lot of the study organisms we have here, whether it be a bobcat or a coyote or a mountain lion. So we want to make sure that we're in a solid frame so that if and when something's crawling towards the camera, we're able to see the feet, the head, and the back of it. So it's always a humbling experience going into work and thinking, all right, here we go, round 2, round 3, round 10, crawl towards a camera that'll be placed here for months at a time. Other times when you're in the field, again, we really appreciate rain here in the park. You will have a camera that had been submerged for weeks at a time. So it takes you about an hour messing with the lock, adjusting the height just to pry off the lockbox. And you can see the image on the right here is the camera installed in place. And because of how much rain and how long it was submerged, it was caked in with sediment. So we needed a variety of different tools just to wiggle out the soil so we can get it out of the lockbox and see the images on there. And it's pretty funny. I don't have it on this slide, but you have the camera here and it's taking photos because it's detecting motion, and you just see the water level rising and rising and rising and rising and rising. And then it just turns black. And then when the water comes down, just a bunch of dirt in front of the lens. So nature is nature. And then if you're really, really, really lucky, you will go out with a technician and you'll go to the site and realize, oh, that's kind of funny. Someone left their gloves here. I wonder who it could have been. And you're noticing the gloves are a little damp. You don't think anything of it. You take your camera, you're reviewing the photos, and you see not even a half hour before you went to retrieve the camera, there's a pack of coyotes chewing away a random glove. Who could possibly think what that is, right? And then the best part is we're assessing our notes, we're looking it over, and turns out it was one of my gloves I had left behind from when I deployed the camera a few months ago. And the cherry on top was we were looking at the glove, assessing it, and the coyotes had this great sense of humor in that they chewed off all of the fingers except for the middle one. So that's on us for leaving our field equipment behind. And the fact that we caught it on camera is a really, really special story. So again, even just the images on their own can tell a lot of stories. And when we're looking back on these photos, it gives us context as to what animals are doing, the behavior, a photo in time of that specific landscape. And with these cameras, we can place them hoping for one image and end up with an entirely different story altogether. So with these next set of photos, these are photos of the actual Woolsey fire. So these photos were taken from, pulled from a different project, which were right around with these images right along the 101. So we caught photos right around when the fire crossed the 101 freeway. And of course, no one would ever expect anybody to be out taking photos of a fire as it's raging through. But just by accidentally having the camera in the right place at the right time, we can see how the fire is going through burning the debris, burning the leaf litter versus the trees. And it's just kind of wild to see how quickly it's going through. The more photos you get, it almost turns into a movie. So if you go through them really quickly, you can see the flames just kind of taking over certain vegetation types. And of course, it helps us get that before and after, that comparison to an extent. So the image on the left was taken in 2019, so about a year after the fire. And in 2023, again, these cameras are deployed regularly, but to show you a really big scale of it, you can see the image on the left. The shrubs don't have any greenery on them. They're pretty crunchy looking, and it's an overcast day, so everything just looks darker. Versus on the right, in the springtime, after all those atmospheric rivers, we see this explosion of wildflowers. We have some toyon, nice and green and luscious. We have some popcorn flowers, some chia in the center there, and it's just overall green. And if we hadn't gone back to place a camera in the same place a few years later, we wouldn't see this drastic before and after. Now, we can go by every single day. We're not going to see these changes because they're so small, but seeing them on a large scale can tell you an entirely different story. Same applies at this site that's only a few miles away. On the left, you have this little bunny hanging out here. Again, a lot of dense, dried up vegetation a few years after the fire. And exactly 2 years later to the day, overwhelming amount of deerweed, popcorn flower in full bloom. Just from, again, going back and monitoring the same site again after a set period of time. And then this is a slide I showed earlier where we have this before and after of our vegetation monitoring team. They go out and assess pretty much the same sites we have cameras on, but of course they focus on plants and we focus on animals. And again, on the left, nice and dense green vegetation. On the right, entirely barren. They went back the spring after the Woolsey fire, and you're seeing this regrowth. You're seeing this new vegetation. And if you remember, the spring of 2019 was a huge hotspot year for wildflowers in the area because it was entirely barren, meaning plants that aren't deeply rooted can easily establish themselves and bloom like crazy if the resources and the conditions are right. So on the left, June of 2018, so the summer before the fire, December 4th, 2018, about a month after the fire, crunchy brown, brown from pure soil, March of 2019, so about 4 to 5 months after the fire, we see that green coming back. So taking one photo is great. That's awesome. You got one set of data points. A series of photos will give you a much clearer picture of what's going on in that area. And of course, our vegetation team continues monitoring to see, again, if we get those plants established, the wildlife will come in right after. So make sure the plants are good and then see what goes from there. And some preliminary data I really briefly want to highlight when it comes to some of the wildlife research we have here. On the right, you have a picture of one of our cute little bunnies, our rabbit species here in the park. And the image on the right is showing you, or the graph, map, design picture on the left is showing you a map of all the site locations this brush and cottontail rabbits have been detected in this research project. So each of these points, these beautiful orange, red, pink, white points on the left of the figure, shows you a point in which we have a camera. The bigger the point, the brighter the color, the more frequently we're catching this species, in this case, a rabbit, in a certain location. So it's exciting to see where we can't necessarily say for a fact, yes, we have more rabbits in this spot, because for all you know, it's the same animal bouncing around in circles in front of the camera, but we're able to get a better idea of the population, the type of ecosystem preference that certain species are finding. So just overall, if we're looking at the map, again, that orangey blob is the fire outlining the Woolsey fire, and the larger the point, the more detections we're seeing of that rabbit. Again, by itself, that's pretty cool. That shows you we have a lot of rabbits, or excuse me, it shows us we have a lot of detections of rabbits. Pair it up with data from a similar species, in this case, a gray fox, and you can see there's a nice overlap between the two, which makes sense because, like the image on the right shows you, gray foxes predate on rabbits, so it makes sense there's an overlap between the two. So one data point is great, more data points give you a bigger picture. So by comparing species detection rates across the areas, it gives you a better, clearer picture of the wildlife communities and how they interact with one another. And of course, because they're very popular species we have here in the park, Folks always ask about mountain lions. Now, it's important to note that the whole Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area at any given time has about 12 to 15, 12 to 16 mountain lions. We know there's not that many. So when we look at our map, and we're not surprised to see that there's aren't as many bright colors, we're not seeing as many detections because there aren't as many mountain lions. Doesn't mean that we're going to catch photos of every single one. Doesn't mean we're going to be there at the right time when the mountain lion's doing something really cool and really shiny that we should have caught on camera. It just shows us at this range, at this point in time, this was the number of mountain lions we saw in an area. And this is just looking general. We can go into specifics and see, okay, based on the image, could we tell whether the lion is a male or female? Can we tell if any cub members are present? Could we tell if it's an adult or a juvenile? Again, you ask one small question and series of tangents and tiny questions and rabbit holes are like jumping in. So big question, small questions turn into bigger questions, turn into smaller answers, which add on to big. It's a beautiful conglomerate of questions and answering, trying to figure out what goes where. And like I mentioned earlier, a lot of the photos that we have, we always encourage volunteers to help us identify what we're looking at. The AI we have, or the AI that we rely on with our volunteer, helps us sort out blanks versus cars versus animals. It's not at that point yet where it can tell us confidently what a mountain lion is versus a fox. So we use the web platform called Zooniverse, and I'll include some information at the end as well. So it's an online platform where you can jump online from the comfort of your own home, library, whatever your favorite place is, and help us identify animals. On the right of the image here, we have this cute little guide that walks you through what you're looking at. So if you're not too sure if you're looking at a bobcat versus domestic cat versus a fox, it'll walk you through, okay, let's look at the ears, let's look at the tail. So you don't have to have experience, and it's just a fun way to give back to your park while just hanging out in bed and looking at cute animal photos. If you're lucky, the animal will be very clear, like this ground squirrel right in front of a creek. Other times just like part of an ear, part of a tail, but it adds to the challenge of it all. And I do want to highlight as well that all the images that I've been showing on this slide here are currently at display at the King Gillette Ranch Visitor Center. So they've been up since August 1st, and I will be taking down the exhibit Monday, December 23rd. So you've got about a week and change, if you are interested, to go and see these images blown up with captions describing what's going on for free. Just go hang out. I'd be silly to not highlight that the entire exhibit was entirely funded and supported by the Santa Monica Mountains Fund in partnership with the National Park Service, whose research we're highlighting here. But it's, in my very unbiased opinion, a fun way to learn more about the native wildlife we have here in the park. And some takeaway messages as we wrap up the first portion of our presentation here. The Santa Monica Mountains are, of course, a highly biodiverse area and support a wide variety of vegetation, of animals, of insects, of butterflies. There's a lot going on regardless of if you're more of a coastal versus valley versus canyon type of hiker, biker, runner, jogger, horseback rider. We are part of one of 5 regions in the entire world that have a Mediterranean ecosystem. And while we are very special and unique, we have to acknowledge that our wildfires are a natural part of our ecosystem. Our vegetation is adapted, not dependent on the wildfires. So while they are a natural part of our ecosystem, it's the frequency that they're coming that has us a little on edge with recovery efforts. Long-term monitoring, whether it be with our vegetation team, our cameras, our wildlife division, will help us get a bigger picture of what's going on in an area and help us create that baseline. So for when the next big change comes, whether it be another wildfire or the construction of the world's largest wildlife crossing, we're able to take note of how these changes are impacting our natural communities. Camera traps, when used appropriately, can help us gather incredible data on its behavior, on how animals interact with one another and how they interact with their ecosystem. And of course, conservation is only as effective as the collaboration between the people and the organization. So if or when I have more images available to process on Zooniverse, I highly encourage you to follow us on social media. We'll have a big old blurb saying, come hang out with us online, go through photos and learn and practice more identifying the wildlife you have in your local national park. And these are all my contact informations. Feel free to take a photo, take a note. I'll type it in the chat at some point during the break. I'm happy to answer some questions while we're here. I do realize we're a little after 11, but I'm happy taking about 5 to 10 minutes answering any questions that are in the chat. But if you have to take off, things come up, you can't make the second half of the portion, thanks for joining me this morning. Feel free to send me an email about anything I mentioned today. If you're interested in more about the public programming that's hosted by the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area, as well as the Santa Monica Mountains Fund, this includes volunteer opportunities, this includes ways to get free plants from the park, this includes more of these virtual and/or in-person talks. They'll all be available on samofund.org/calendar. And of course, I always recommend folks to follow us on social media. That'll be the best place to go if you're interested in public events, as well as big news coming around in the park. So I'm going to stop there so I can grab a drink of water, but I am happy to stick around. I want to make sure we have time for a break so everyone can stretch their legs before the second half here. But I do want to thank all of you for joining me today, and I appreciate your time. I'm gonna stop sharing just for a moment. I'll go ahead and drop all this information in the chat as well, but feel free to raise your hand, write in the chat if you have any questions, comments, concerns we can address before the second part of the presentation. But thank you everyone again for joining. And I'm just going to go through here. So we've got a question from John regarding a short emergency alert call to evacuate within, I'm assuming with a fire warning. I wish I can give you an answer there. The Park Service, we have our fire division, but we're not the ones responsible for sending out emergency alerts altogether. I would assume it's based off of either county or city ordinances. So based off of based off of where you got the notification, I would recommend reaching out there. But I agree, 5 minutes is a very short amount of time when it comes to evacuation. I'm sorry you had to go through such a rush there. There's another question asking, why didn't you replant with fire-resistant trees or plants to reduce our fire insurance? That's a wonderful question. And the short answer is, we're in a national recreation area and we want to preserve and protect the public lands we have here. So we want to reduce the amount of human interference. Just because we as humans are already increasing the amount of wildfires that are coming to an area, we want to keep it as natural and as lush as possible. And fortunately, nature is self-sustaining. So if we were to go and place species that aren't commonly found or non-native to the area, that would involve us constantly maintaining that area and further impacting the environment. And we don't know how a fire-resistant tree is going to do with a fire-adapted tree altogether. Kind of brings in the point of like non-native versus invasive species, how you can bring in an organism that isn't native to an area, but you don't know how it'll interact with the rest of the community. So while on a dollars and cents plan, it seems like it would make more sense, it would most likely end up costing a lot more in terms of maintenance and mitigation further down the line. Good question, though. Next question, what percentage of the animals are tracked? Good question. So we only track certain study organisms. So at this time, the park is collaring mountain lions, bobcats, gray foxes, deer, and in the recent past, we were collaring coyotes for an urban study. So there's only certain periods of time where the animals aren't mating or they don't have their young ones with them, just because collaring an animal can be stressful. So we want to make sure we target the animal during the least stressful amount of time in its lifetime. So percentage-wise, it's a really small percent for sure, especially with animals very common, or more common, such as bobcats and coyotes. With mountain lions, I know there is an effort to try collaring them year-round because there's so few of them. We want to see how they interact all together. So the percentage is going to vary depending on the species. Is it possible for a private citizen to put up a wildlife camera on their property? Absolutely. And depending on your needs, how high-tech you want to go with it, these cameras that we use for this project specifically, they don't use cellular data, so we need to go to them regularly to check what's on the cameras. But I know some folks rely on solar cameras, smaller ones, and price range is going to vary a lot. So it's up to you. And if you own your property, having a question amongst yourself, a mental conversation. If you are renting, it's up to whoever manages the property to ask them. But again, just be responsible and mindful, especially to keep in mind what wildlife are there. So I know in, for example, the Sierra Nevadas, I have a colleague who they have to put a bunch of locks and chains on their cameras because bears will dig into them a lot. Here, it's not as big of an issue, but you want to be mindful of the animals you're trying to get photos of. Let's see. There we go. Good question. Couldn't the cameras have a live feed like a Ring camera? Why don't they? Are placement locations usually along an animal trail? Yes, yes, and yes. So these cameras, the ones I use, there are other models that do have satellite cellular data, but because we're placing the cameras intentionally off the trails where people aren't going to go, they're in areas that typically don't have cellular service. Even if you have a hotspot, it'll be like 0 times 0. Not much is going to be going on there. For our researchers that do work with live animals, they use those cellular-based cameras to detect when an animal's in their trap, so they know right away when to go and help out with the animals. And our placement locations usually along an animal trail. Yes, intentionally off the main or the social trail so people aren't messing with the cameras. Another question. It must be expensive to run these programs. Is it worth it or just unimportant, although interesting information? Valid concern. A lot of times people question, what's the point if we already know a fire is going to come? What does it matter? All of this. And a lot of it, again, does come down. I think there's a question earlier about fire insurance too. So nature protects nature. So if we can have a healthy ecosystem, it'll preserve and maintain and reduce a lot of these concerns that we're always on edge about, like wildfires. For example, I think I mentioned it earlier in the talk, if nothing were to happen, everything were consistent, and there was no human intervention in this area, there would be one major fire every 70 to 100 years. Because of the impact we've had, we're getting a fire on that scale. Again, the number, take it with a grain of salt, every 20, 23, 28 years at a time. So by monitoring and seeing how our impacts are affecting the natural ecosystem altogether, we're able to mitigate these risks for us and for the wildlife. And it helps us get a better idea of conservation efforts altogether. So our researchers, I think it was 7 years ago now, collaborated with a university, and they revealed that if we don't do anything and we just let nature do its thing altogether, our population of mountain lions could be extinct within 50 years. That's a really short amount of time for any population to go extinct. And again, a lot of it comes not intentionally, but from the impacts of humans being in the area. So by monitoring, it helps us see any red flags that come up so we're not scrambling to try saving something, an organization, a plant, organism, before it's too late. By monitoring before we get to that point, we can help keep things at that constant, stable level. Another question regarding fire could also burn at the Annenberg crossing itself since it'll be highly landscaped. Isn't that possible? So that'll be our last question because I realize it is 11:15 and we gotta breathe. That's a very valid question. And the crossing itself, it's established to be large enough and deep enough so that we can grow native plants on the crossing itself. So it's not just going to look like a sidewalk, it'll be a connection of the two landscapes merging together. So by landscaping, it'll be intentionally, we're growing plants that are from either side of the freeway. We are farming the fungi to have that soil stay nice and sturdy on that level. So what we're going to do is, or we as in agencies and collaborators, is we're going to establish the plants so that it's, again, fire adapted, not fire resistant on here. So of course, fires are possible. It's going to be a connection of the ecosystem, but that's going to be one of those things where it's just like everything else with the rest of the park. We want to make sure when nature does come by and do what nature does, it's in a place where it's safe and relatively reliable for folks. It is 11:15. I'm gonna suggest we take about 5-7 minute. Let's take a 5-minute break. I will be back on at 11:20. to continue the second part of the program, which will be highlighting some of my favorite images that are on display at the King Gillette Ranch. Again, if you can't join me for this last segment of the talk, all of these images that I'm showing are still at the King Gillette Ranch Visitor Center. And I encourage you to check it out before I take everything down December 23rd. If for those of you who are going to stick around, let's jump back on at 11:20. So stretch your legs, grab some water, use the restroom, and I will see you in a short bit. Thanks for joining me. All righty. Thank you everyone for sticking around and staying strong and listening to me to talk for another 40-ish minutes. The second part of the presentation program talk webinar will be focused on just looking at some of the highlight images, again, that are currently at display at the King Gillette Ranch Visitor Center. And there was a question in the chat. Thank you, Jean, for bringing it up. The Visitor Center is closed today due to the Franklin fire. We are tentatively hoping we will open up again tomorrow back to standard operating hours, so Wednesday through Sunday, 9 to 4 a.m. But our social media, we typically post on Instagram and Facebook for last minute changes. So I would recommend checking there just to confirm that we'll be open the rest of the week. For sure closed today, tentatively open tomorrow. Our social media page will have the latest updates. So let me go ahead and pull up my slides for the second portion. All right. All right. So part two of our images on display. As a quick refresher, these images are pretty, they are wonderful, they are awesome. They are just data points though. We want to make sure that all the images we catch have relevant information. So across all the images, you will see the same black border and header on the top and the bottom. The top will give you the date and the time on the top left corner, and the right will give you the moon, or the right corner will give you the moon phase and the temperature of when this photo was taken. And on the bottom left, we have a camera number we place on there. That's more for internal use. It's not so much, camera 28 is going to give you something than camera 29 type thing, but just so you can get a reference on what we have. So when you head to the visitor center, you're going to see each panel has a different theme associated with it. So that'll be on the top bar of the image there. It'll tell you what theme panel it's related to and the image caption. So one of the most, we have what's called a power wall. So as soon as you walk in, you see, wow, big shiny picture. And one of my favorite photos on there is this family of mountain lions up in the Santa Monica Mountains. So it's not snow, it's just very pale rock. And you can see that this image was taken December 21st, 2022 at around 9 a.m. And it's nice and crispy, nice chill at 50 degrees. So you can see we have one mountain lion right here, front and center, with not just one kitten keeping her company, but a second one just on top here. So based off the location and the date and the time, with help of our researchers here and our biologists, we always like comparing notes to see what's around. We have P80, so mama lion here is P80, or the 80th mountain lion collared in our now 22-year mountain lion study. And she's living just a few miles off the coastline, so not too far from the coastal canyon. And she has her 3-month-old kittens, P107 and P108. Note that they don't have collars because they're still growing, but what our researchers do is when they are able to find a mountain lion den, they'll still associate them with a number and they'll put a little ear tag on them that will eventually fall off, but we have the tissue sample. So we're able to, if we find another mountain lion in the future, match up which line is associated with which litter. Lions will typically take care of their little ones for about 18 months here in the Santa Monica Mountains, and then they're often about to live their solitary life. So again, we've got P80 with P107 and P108, not too far along the coast. And of course, cats are cats. They will do what they got to do. These next two images, for those who are a little squeamish when it comes to predator-prey interactions, I don't know if you want to take a deep breath or close your eyes for a little bit. This next image is a bobcat with an animal in its mouth, but it's not graphic or anything. So 3, 2, 1. We have a proud camper here. So bobcats are obligate carnivores, like most cats across the world, in that they have to eat meat. They can't eat anything else, or if they do, in very small quantities, but they must eat meat. And what's really interesting with this photo is that you have a bobcat in the bottom left corner here in 2021, and you can still see remnants of the fire. So you have these charred shrubs on the top, and you can see this bobcat has what looks like a rabbit half of its size, just kind of walking through. And I don't own a cat. I know people who own cats, and I've taken care of them here and there. But it's always funny how when they have something big in their mouth, they have to walk with their head up, and they look very proud because they're moving their shoulders very, back and forth. And, bobcats are not that tall. So if they have anything, they have to do a similar kind of walk to make sure they're not dragging whatever's in their mouth for too long. And of course, it's wild to see that you have wildlife just in the background. You have urbanization or buildings right behind it. So coexistence is possible. This next image is a little more graphic than this one. It's a turkey vulture with an animal head in its beak. Again, one of the coolest photos I've ever seen, especially for this project, but I am aware I might have a stronger stomach than others. So 3, 2, 1. We have what I titled Heavy Metal Life Cycles. So we have a turkey vulture with a bobcat kitten's head in its mouth. What's wild about this photo, aside from seeing the turkey vulture kind of staring down the camera, is that you can clearly identify the animal that it's munching away on. Turkey vultures are known to eat carrion, so it's basically dead animal decaying down and around wherever it can find it. So turkey vultures are kind of known as janitors in the wildlife world, and that they munch away on what typically isn't eaten regularly or voluntarily amongst a lot of critters. And this photo, at the time this photo was taken, it was 115 degrees out. So it's hard to tell how long, just from this image, how long the bobcat kitten body had been there, but it doesn't seem like has affected the turkey vulture too much. And here you can see that turkey vultures, they have that iconic bright red head. It's known, or it's believed to be an evolutionary adaptation where they don't have too many feathers on their head, their face, their neck, because they're constantly digging around to munch away on the dead animals. So to minimize any bacteria growth or mites that might transfer from the dead animal to their head, it's considered almost barren because it's not like they have a place to wash their hands or wash their face regularly. And of course, on a nice hot day, imagine just experiencing or seeing something like that. It's pretty wild altogether. Sticking with the bird theme of the series, we have one of our iconic road runners in the background here in Simi Valley. And it's hard to tell from this angle, but if you were to zoom in, stare up close to the print inside the visitor center, you'll see it's carrying a lizard in its mouth. Now, these roadrunners have this beautiful, it kind of looks like blue eyeshadow along their face and on their tips of their tail. And they're a type of cuckoo bird in that they can mimic a lot of different sounds, but unlike what you would commonly think a bird to do is fly, these fellas, they're more of a ground birds and that they prefer running around, and they have really powerful legs. Their primary diet consists of reptiles, whether it be lizards or whether it be snakes. So you'll commonly see them hiding around and bouncing around frequently in the shrublands here in the Santa Monica Mountains. And they typically will end up sticking around these habitats just because there's far fewer birds that hang out in the ground of this area where it's really dense vegetation. You're not going to be able to navigate as clearly in the area. So they have less competition against other birds who might be eating similar foods. Next up, we have 2 coyote pups just hanging out, and it kind of looks like they're doing a dental inspection on one another. And coyotes are, for many reasons, a very charismatic species, especially because how their social groups can vary a lot. Some coyotes hang out on their own. They don't have a pack of their own. They don't want to hang out with other coyotes. Others prefer staying in that family unit, which typically consists of an alpha male and female who breed and have litters of their own. And they'll have like an aunt and a cousin or an uncle come and help take care and raise the little pups there. And of course, like most mammals, the early developmental stages of these critters before they reach maturity is really important when it comes to establishing these social bonds. So the fact that we're able to catch at 3:49 a.m. a pair of young pups hanging out and just playing and messing around with each other's teeth is really, for me, it's a really sweet sight to see. And again, it shows the importance of those social bonds across taxonomic levels or species altogether. The importance of having that socialization altogether. This next photo here, it looks almost like it was staged. And I don't think I mentioned it during the first hour of our talk, but for some projects, they, depending on the research project and the biologist's needs, requests, what they're looking for specifically, they will place bait tablets to encourage wildlife to come in. For this project, because it is just that recovery, it is just looking at monitoring, we're not trying to impact or influence the wildlife altogether. We're just letting them do what they want to do naturally. So when we get these really cool symmetrical images like this one, it's pretty lucky, really. And mule deer, they are the only deer species we have here in the park. They are known as mule deer because they have these not obnoxious, but these unusually proportioned ears in relation to their face. And they're known for munching away almost on any type of greenery. So they'll eat grasses, they'll eat herbs, they'll eat shrubs, they'll eat acorns, and depending on the season, their diet will change with it. So in this case, we can see in 2021, so about 3 years after the fire, we have a landscape where you still have a bunch of burnt vegetation. It's August, so it's near the end of the summer, so it makes sense that things are nice and crunchy and brown given the warm heat we get in the summer. But this deer looks like it's just kind of hanging out, and it probably did find a meal to eat. They're pretty clever critters, depending on where you live or where your neighbors are. Some might think they're adorable when they walk by. Others with vegetable gardens might not be as big of a fan because they'll munch away on whatever seems palatable to them during that time of year. Here we have another set of coyotes howling away. So, like I mentioned earlier, with coyotes, they rely heavily on their social groups. So it looks like they were kind of cozying up, getting ready to knock out, and then a few moments later, they start howling in unison. Howls for coyotes can be, it's kind of like us shouting, depending on what they're saying, can have a different representation or a different meaning. So sometimes coyotes will howl just to say, I'm here, and wait for other family members or other coyotes in their social group to shout back, we heard you, we know you're here, I'm here too. Other times they'll howl at different frequencies and tones to sound like there's a much bigger group when they're yapping away to kind of warn others, I'm here, don't mess with me, I'd like to rest up a little, or whatever the case may be. So again, coyotes, they do have a pretty strong reliance on these social bonds amongst one another, but doesn't necessarily mean they're not social with others outside of their respective groups that they were growing with. And you can see this really strong social connection, not just with coyotes, but with mule deer as well. So this was a really lucky find, again, at 3:46 a.m. What an interesting time for wildlife. But we have 2 juvenile males. The male on the right is known as a spike buck because its horn or its antlers only have 1 spike, meaning it's a year old, roughly. And the deer on the left has that fork on its antlers. So it's believed, because it has another branch on that main antler, it's believed to be about 2 years old. So you have 2 relatively young bachelors practicing out for the rutting season. And this typically happens in near the end of the year, around the fall, where males will basically ram heads with each other to try to show off, especially when there's a female nearby, to see who is, who is showiest, who is is worth wooing and courting when it comes to the female selecting who she wants to mate with. And especially with these young juveniles, just from the series of images we had on the cameras, they weren't bashing because they looked like they were going at it for a little bit. They were just kind of like bumping heads back and forth, but you can tell they weren't launching their whole bodies into it. So because of their age and because of the series of images we have, we're assuming that this is most likely just practicing to getting a feel of it, to be like, all right, this is how it goes. This works best. This angle doesn't. So when the rutting season does come, they can be as competitive as possible when it comes to mate selection. And of course, with selection comes adorable animals after the gestation period. So here we have two young gray foxes running out and about. And these are really fun to spot just because gray foxes on their own are pretty small. They're maybe about the size of a house cat. They're just so poofy. It's deceptive. They look bigger, or you would think they're bigger than they are, and then you approach one and they're really not that big, which means their kits are even smaller. They're tiny itty bitty little fellas. And gray foxes are a type of canid, so they're a type of dog. So similar with coyotes, they do have rely on creating those social bonds as they're developing, and they're getting slightly bigger than the size they are there. And kids will join the adults for about 3 months when it comes to hunting, and they typically practice hunting and just existing all together in this dense chaparral environment. So similar to where our roadrunner was on an earlier slide, again, to reduce the competition they have amongst other carnivores. Gray foxes, they're not very big. So if they are going for the same meal as a coyote, it's very likely a coyote or a larger predator will get that meal. But with their small, compact size, they're able to navigate through that dense shrubbery a lot more. They're a lot more agile. They're able to get around much more easily versus if you were to have a much larger animal trying to barrel their way through here. We also have catch really lucky encounters here, including this mule deer mom and her young one nursing off of her. So mule deer will actually carry their fawn for 200 days. So what is that, like 2/3-ish of a year in utero? And when the young are born, they're known as, they stick together with mom, and mom is incredibly defensive of her little one. And you'll see, just like in Bambi, the young have, in this case, the fawn has these beautiful white spots along their back and their rump, so that when mom leaves the little one alone to kind of camouflage themselves in the grass or dense vegetation, those white spots help break up the shape of their body. So it kind of looks like light is reflecting through the vegetation so that predators won't easily go and try to munch away on what could be a quick meal. But again, mom and little one, they will stick together for almost an entire year at a time. And mom is always gonna be very defensive of her little one. And then speaking of defenses, I always enjoy highlighting that here in our park, we don't have just one common stripe, or we don't have just one skunk species. We in fact have two. So the image on the right is the western striped skunk, which you have most commonly smelled, especially along a highway, or if you're unlucky enough, you might have seen or been sprayed by one. Dogs commonly get sprayed because they're curious little critters. But the western striped skunk is a pretty decent size. And like all skunk species, they can spray you with a very foul scent from an anal gland they have. And this is used as a last resort defense. So skunks want to maintain that scent for emergencies because it takes them about 7 days to recharge or refill the odorous smell from their anal glands. So typically what they'll do as defense is that they'll poof up and they'll charge at you as if they're going to spray you, but it's really just a bluff. And then if you're still messing around or they're still frightened, then they'll turn around, spray you, and run away. And the spotted skunk on the left hand here is the exact same way. The main difference between the two skunks right off the bat is the size. So a spotted skunk is going to be probably less than half the size of a striped skunk. They both eat the same things. They're insectivores. They'll eat fruits, any small critters they can get their teeth on. But what's different with the spotted versus the striped skunk is stripes versus spots. Right, you can see it right away. But what's also really unique with the spotted skunk is that their front legs are slightly shorter than their rear legs. So when they're charging at you to warn you, saying, don't mess with me, I'm scary, look at my black and white coloration, that means don't approach, they'll actually do a handstand, or they'll walk towards you on those shorter front legs, showing you those spots in very clear sight because they have to make themselves look bigger. They're already so small as that defense mechanism. Again, they don't want to spray because it takes so long to constantly recharge, but they're just so small, and in my opinion, they're adorable. They look like little toys. But what's really unique here in the park is that we don't know much about them. We get photos here and there. They're very uncommon, that's for sure, that we have an idea of what what habitats they prefer, but we know very little about their population size. We're not sure how they compete with, the common striped skunk. We're not sure where they go during, if they have a seasonality change in habitat like we know with our mule deer. So there's a lot of unknowns. Again, one question leads to a bunch of different tangents. And the fact that we're able to catch these images just in passing, just from this long-term monitoring, makes it really exciting. And that the next project we host or the next researcher who's in the park might have more information. We're able to compare and share that data. Speaking of sharing the data, we of course are getting several images of collared animals in the park. Like we mentioned it right before the break, they're in the park, we collar coyotes, or we collared, it's no longer an active project. We collar coyotes, bobcat, gray fox, deer, and mountain lions. So these collars have two different type of frequencies on them. One of them has a GPS unit, so it'll send a location a few times a day. So we can't just log on and say, oh, this deer is right across the street. It's sporadically sent across the day whenever there is signal. And I believe the collars are, if not less than 5%, less than 10% of the animal's body weight. So there's always concerns, very valid concerns, about having an animal wear something that it's not normally supposed to wear. And there's a series of permits and regulations that our biologists and every biologist has to fill out regularly to make sure that we are making sure that the welfare of the animal is prioritized and we minimize any obstructions to the animal. So the collars for all species are placed so that there's space for the animals to take deep breaths, have their throat move as well, and to minimize any rubbing or chafing along the neck, because we want the animal to be comfortable. The whole point is to study, not to harm the animal. So a great amount of care is placed on collars as well as ear tags for the species. So each collar will have a GPS unit that will send locations a few times a day. And we also have telemetry. So you might have seen some photos of researchers where it looks like they're holding up a radio antenna or like a satellite antenna. It's very forked and has all these branches, and it'll give you, just based off the sound, will give you an idea of where the animal is. If you're really, really good at it, which I am definitely not, you can get pretty close to the animal, but animals are animals, so they will still move if they get freaked out and hear that someone is approaching. So here we have one of our recently collared deer. This is D11, or the 11th deer collared in this fairly new mountain lion project. And she is an adult female, a little doe who lives off of Paramount Ranch. And she's known, and she's been seen by researchers as almost the matriarch or the head honcho of her herd, because she's been seen kicking other deer away from her favorite napping spots. So again, it's fun to see, and we have to remind ourselves that animals aren't just this mysterious blob. They have personalities, they have quirks, they have traits. So whenever we do this monitoring, this studying, we learn a lot more about them, including the fact that they have preferred napping spots, and they can even have mini fights and spats with people amongst their own family group or their herd. going along the lines of spotting our collared animals, we have this bobcat, which again also has that collar and that clear ear tag. And this one here was collared near the Calabasas Library in 2018. So a lot of the animals that were collared here around that time were part of the continued study to make sure that at the time it was still just, it was more of a concrete idea, but we were still collecting the data for the Wallace-Annenberg Wildlife Crossing. So their data points helped us see, okay, where are species of predators, prey, of carnivores, of herbivores, where are they moving? Where are they dancing? What kind of habitat are they going around? And specifically around Liberty Canyon, where are they trying to bounce around? Do they attempt going towards the freeway? Do they attempt crossing? Do they avoid it altogether? And this is where, again, take decades of data, not just because we're sitting there and waiting, but it takes us years to understand and collect enough data to give you that bigger picture of, okay, you need X, Y, and Z to create a crossing that will appeal to A, B, C species. So one collar can give you a lot of, just like with our images, one point can give you a snapshot, but you want to get the whole picture, the whole movie almost. So this fellow was collared right by the Calabasas landfill, and we studied them for a few years before their collar just naturally fell off. And I don't remember if I mentioned it, but each collar will have it's either a piece of fabric or a magnet where as soon as you start it, or like it's almost like a timer, where over time it'll just kind of fall off on its own. So these animals aren't expected to carry this collar for the rest of their lives. It's just for a period of time, and then researchers will go and ideally they are able to retrieve the collar, maintain it, do routine maintenance, check it up, and then deploy it onto the other individual if it applies to them. Of course, we have our mountain lions, our iconic critter here in the park. So P77, or the 77th mountain lion of our study, was collared over in Simi Hills, and she most recently had a litter of kittens in May of 2023. So she still is zooming around in Simi, and she was collared a year after the Woolsey fire. So it's exciting to see that we have, fully mature breeding mountain lions even after the Woolsey fire. And here's a fun one where you're probably going to have to squint to see this little critter. We saw the juvenile versions of these canids, and they're very unique in that their name has one color, but they actually have at least 3 different colors on them. And I'll give you like another 5 seconds, see if you can find them. And here we go. We have our gray fox blending in really well with that chaparral. So the gray fox is gray on its back. It has this beautiful little orange layer kind of dividing its body in half, and then it has a pale underbelly. So it's this combination of colors as well as the dense vegetation of the chaparral and how those colors change across the season, where it makes it really, really well camouflaged depending on the angle, depending on how you're seeing it. And what's really sweet about these gray foxes, like I mentioned earlier, is that they do well and best in these chaparral environments because there's minimal competition for the quail, the rabbits, the smaller prey animals they can catch. But because they're small too, they could easily be preyed on by other animals. So they rely on camouflage, not just to hide themselves from their prey, but to hide from other predators as well. Then here we've got another unique sense of camouflage where you'll see the blob of an animal right on the bottom center here. And here we have a clever coyote where they may not be relying heavily, or in this image, it's not relying heavily on the color of the fur of the animal, but instead the vegetation and how dense it is actually breaking up the shape of the animal really well. So it's hard to tell where's the head, where's the tail, what direction it's facing. And oftentimes, predators will rely on a variety of different camouflage tactics to get as close as they can to a prey animal and have a successful hunt versus expending energy and kind of just being hungry for the rest of the evening, the day, whenever they're hunting away. one of the most unique captures I was really excited and confused to see about is we have this male deer with what appears to have an antler growing off from the side of its head. Normally, you would expect deer, as most horned and antlered animals, to have them grow right off the top. So it's perfect for when it's coming to the rutting season and they're able to fight and compete in defense and all the standard we know and are comfortable with knowing about with the deer. But this image was really unique because it shows that it almost looks like the antler curves and grows around and it's just swooping off the side of the eye. So I had to reach out to our biologists who study deer, and there have been studies, not specifically done here in our park, but there have been studies that have shown that because male deer grow antlers every single year, they have a certain area on their head known as peduncles, where the cells know, okay, given seasonality, given a marker, they'll know, okay, time to grow, and you just shoot off and grow bones off the top of their head. If the animal, in this case the deer, gets damage to any other body part, whether it be, a damaged bone or the cells on the top of their head themselves will get damaged, it'll alter and actually it's almost like a miscalculation of how the bone should grow. And it's believed here that there was some sort of damage, whether it was during this buck's development or earlier in the year they damaged themselves a lot, that the body of the deer, instead of prioritizing growing bone here, shifts its nutrients to whatever other body part needs that extra bump up, that internal band-aid almost, so that whenever the bone does grow, as it normally would, it's not as strong as it would be. Instead of expecting to go straight, it's curving off to the side because nutrients and resources might have been allocated to a different body part to take care of it. And again, it's really spooky. You wouldn't expect to see a wonky antler in the middle at 1:30 a.m. on a camera like this, but it took researchers were excited to see that, when else are you going to find a unique find like this, something so quirky and out of place? And then, of course, we have yet another silly outtake. Of course, it's hard to tell if animals are aware that photos are being taken, but you get these really sweet moments where you have, in this case, a female deer with her twins right behind her, and it looks like they're almost posing, just staring at the camera, where you have mom just confused and the two kids uninterested altogether. And typically deer here in the Santa Monica Mountains, the first time they do carry young, it's not uncommon that their first fawns are actually twins versus a single fawn altogether. And again, that just means she's got to be double vigilant, double defensive, and double on edge when it comes to taking care of her little ones. So this was just a quick preview of some of the images and the themes you will see if you choose to visit the visitor center at King Gillette Ranch in the next week and a half, just under 2 weeks. It'll be there through December 22nd. And there are tentative plans. I'm sure we'll promote it on our social media accounts as well. But this exhibit was installed in hopes to be a rotating exhibit. So we have plans to, if all goes well, to have it bouncing around a few libraries in Newberry Park and Thousand Oaks in the spring. So nothing set in stone just yet, but we hope to have it continue bouncing around. So again, I want to thank everyone for your time. It is just under noon. If you have any other questions, by all means, go ahead and write it in the chat. I made sure and I copied and pasted all of this information into the chat. So if you have any other questions, comments, concerns, you know how to contact me, or you can go ahead and write them in the chat if you are interested. Oh, there we go. There is a question regarding shooting chemical tranquilizers into animals to trap them must affect them in some way. How does this affect their natural life? Great question. So we typically, with these chemical tranquilizers, it's a special kind in that it's kind of like, how to phrase it? It's like you knock out the animal, but then you give it an antidote right away to wake up. So our biologists have hours and hours and hours of training across years. It's not just a one and done crash course to understand how to maintain a healthy zone of vitals for the animal. So when the animal is tranquilized, to do the assessment, place the collar, we're constantly checking the vitals, temperature, breathing rate. We have various, like, I guess, antidotes to the tranquilizer on deck. So in case anything were to happen, we're able to release the animal. And if at any point it seems like the animal's health is in danger, all workups, all procedures are halted and we let the animal go. We are not by any means the only park that does this kind of study. And it's great because there's a network of parks and other agencies across the US and across the world that have similar studies. So there have been studies that have noted that the animal might have been a little, of course, dazed after being tranquilized for a short period of time, but there aren't any signs or displays of it impacting the animal's life as it continues going out and about. If there are anything that's going out of place, like I said, the procedures are halted altogether and make sure the animal goes out and about on its own. But very valid question. Thank you. And then we've got another question asking about whether or not the wildlife bridge will be accessible to bikers versus hikers. So the bridge, of course, is intended for wildlife and wildlife only. So recreationalists, whether they be biking or horseback riding or on their feet, are not welcome to go on the wildlife crossing. I think they're still in the planning stages as to how to make it so people don't go. I wouldn't be surprised if fencing is involved versus I guess people fencing involved is the primary goal. There haven't been any plans established directly to figure out that I'm aware of to limit people from getting on the bridge, but people are people. And as soon as you put up a sign saying don't do this, they'll do that. So I think it's going to be a learn as we go kind of procedure. I know right now the priority is making sure that the crossing itself is nice and well and established so we can start bringing in the vegetation and the soil. And I believe the next year or so, if I'm not mistaken, the phase 2 of the crossing, which involves building a road over Agora, or building a crossing over Agora Road, which is on the south side of the freeway, is going to be coming up next. So short answer, fencing is the goal. Long answer, it's going to be a lot of trial and error because people, bikers, horseback riders, recreationalists are clever. Yeah, I'll be around another few minutes, but again, thank you all so much for your time. I appreciate you hanging out with me for 2 hours today. If you have any other questions, comments, concerns, feel free to email me. My contact information is in the chat. Thank you.